And the last thing before I introduce our speaker, today's session will discuss topics that could be triggering for some folks. If at any time you feel the need to speak with an advocate, please send a private message to our monitor, Hale, or to myself, and we will get you connected with someone just as soon as possible. So Tasa is so excited, and I am so excited to welcome our speaker this morning, Erika Reyna-Brodhag. She's the Prevention Education Manager at the Purple Door in Corpus Christi. I want to thank her for sharing her experience and her knowledge with everyone today and for bringing this important topic to us. And with that, I'll turn it over to Erika to further introduce ourselves and to get us started.
Hello, good morning, everyone. Thank y'all for being with me and attending this workshop. So I'm going to do a quick share of my screen. All right. I hope we're in business and everyone can see. So we'll get started. Again, good morning. Do a little bit of intro. First, just to give you a glimpse of the agenda, some of the topics that we're going to be discussing today. Of course, I know Tim gave a brief trigger warning at the beginning, but I do want to remind everyone the content will talk about suicide. The content may have some forceful and bad language and some of the experiences, quotes, and of course, the video clips that I will share with you today. Another potential trigger, just to give some context, one, the content could challenge a little bit of our belief systems, and I think that's almost the goal. So if you find yourself kind of off-put or, you hear something that I say that could be triggering or something you've read, I think it's really good to sit with that and ask the big questions, because this presentation or this material is really not going to offer a be-all, know-all solution, but only meant to really get the conversation started and what that looks like on an individual level. A lot of the content is going to speak about the societal structures that are put in place that may affect the individual. And of course, this space is going to talk about young men, boys, and adult men. And then, of course, lastly, I want to remind everyone that, of course, I don't have the credentials to diagnose. So I won't, be able to give any kind of diagnoses or talk a little bit about mental health issues in that capacity, but only be able to share some of the anecdotes I've picked up along the way, share some of the experiences I've had and some of the common themes that I had seen working with men, either in a personal or professional capacity. So I'm going to introduce myself and what I do. This is me and my colleague. We do a podcast together, so I thought I'd represent and throw the picture out there in case y'all are interested in podcasts. But again, I'm Erika Reyna-Brodhag. I'm the Prevention and Education Manager here at the Purple Door in Corpus Christi, Texas, representing the Coastal Bend, which consists of 12 counties in our area. I oversee 2 programs: primary prevention, which is to implement prevention programming in our area and really gain okay, I believe I'm back. I also oversee the Battering Intervention and Prevention program here in Corpus Christi. And that is an educational course for men who had offended on their female intimate partner. Of course, I'm a lifelong resident of Corpus Christi, graduated in 2009 at Texas A&M, so I am an Islander. I have to represent Salina. Every time I go places, I tell them I'm from Corpus Christi. The first question I'm always asked is, do you know of Salina? And of course I do, and I'm a big fan. So a couple of things about me on a personal level. One, I was part raised by four brothers. So that kind of gives me some of this context. And then, of course, I'm a mom to two boys and a non-gendered spirit. And I say that to pave the way and say this, I'm a woman. I just call out the elephant in the room, and I am going to be talking about men's issues, and I get that that conflict there. So again, it's built on some experiences, some of the conversations I've had with men, again, in my personal and professional life, working with men who had offended intimate partner violence, working with male colleagues who had not offended, working with community male leaders, and just really listening and absorbing some of their experiences with this content and some of the stories that they wanted to share. And I found some common themes and similarities that I put together within this presentation. So as we get started into the next segment, talk a little bit about harmful masculinity. I do want to say that a lot of the information I pulled here is from the American Psychological Association 2018 Guide to Working with Young Men and Boys. I highly recommend that you read that. It's excellent material. And gave a lot of insight into, again, some of those stories and experiences I was hearing from men that I had worked with and that I had known. And so I want to start here with the harmful masculinity. I know that this term, I may have first heard it a few years back. I know it was a hot topic. A lot of people were very divided. Not many people knew exactly what it meant or what to expect that it would mean. I know I had some personal conversations with some men in my life who were off-put and talked a little bit about how this felt very attacking of them as a man. And I remember just, my little brain at the time being very green to this new material, trying to process with them and offer feedback. Was I right? I don't know, probably not. Was I wrong? Maybe, but just wanting to have that real conversation. And so when harmful masculinity came up with a specific friend, them being able, debate. And we debated, we talked, we agreed to disagree. But some of the points I wanted him to understand was that, I don't think it was attacking him as a man, but more so the societal structure, that it was a societal structure that was really unfair to young men and young boys. And I was, of course, trying to get my point across, which can be wrong at times. So I'm not even trying to put myself on a high horse, but it was an incredible conversation that kind of got me thinking, and I'll take you through that thought process. And so one, of course, the gender bias. This was something that coming into the prevention movement was almost foundation level. I knew that gender roles existed. I knew that at times they could be very rigid, and they were born of beliefs and attitudes that had those stereotypes. We knew that from the time we were little bitty that young girls dressed a certain way, had to behave a certain way, and that young men dressed a certain way and had to behave a certain way. And so that was almost foundation level to the conversation of harmful masculinity. Then you got into the masculine ideology. So really looking at some of the ways that boys and men started to believe how they needed to behave, the attitudes and the belief systems that they had, and really diving deep into that. Again, coming from a home with four brothers who, we're Latinx family. And so that looked different for us, because one thing that I saw in here, we're seeing it in almost a scientific announcement, the anti-feminine, the achievement, renouncing the appearance of looking weak, being adventurous, a risk taker, and even using violence. growing up with the four brothers that I had, and as much as I've learned from them, this was very much viewed or looked at as, yes, I have to take risks. I am not allowed to cry. A lot of emotions got feminized in our household as far as fear, crying, that it got to a point where there was only two emotions that they were going to show. It was going to be humor or anger. And that was it in our household as far as what it came to be a man and masculine roles. But as I expanded my little childhood out and started meeting new men in my life and getting into this professional field, I found that that was a common theme, that men were allowed to be funny and men were allowed to be angry. And that was it when it came to being fearful or expressing sadness and other emotions that we'll get into when we get into the mental health part. It became almost like full stop. I'm not allowed to do that because society said I wasn't. Of course, those weren't the words that they used, but it always came back to, I'm not allowed to do that. So then we came to this harmful masculinity, this term. And of course, Wikipedia defines it as this. Whether Wikipedia is a credible source, I'll allow everyone to judge on their own. But we did look at, the traditional cultural masculine norms. What does it mean to be a man? How does this mean they need to behave? How is society going to view these roles? And, is it realistic? That was a big question. One question that I had come to learn and explore, like, again, through my professional and personal relationships with the men in my life, it was, are these norms realistic? Do they hold weight? Are they damaging? And it wasn't necessarily me trying to tell my friend, hey, being a man is harmful. It was me trying to almost advocate for him. It might not have been welcomed at the moment, but advocate for him that, hey, some of these societal expectations for you are harming you. They could be harming you, considering that you're telling me you're not allowed to cry, you're not allowed to share or embrace your friend when you've gotten good news. And so that was the big question of the day. Are these expectations realistic? Are they harmful? And what are they doing to the men in our life? And so I put together some scenarios, and as we go through them, just thinking about these concepts I went over, I want you to really process them and create a dialogue in the chat box. If you want to unmute and share some of your thoughts or what's, your processes with these scenarios, I encourage you to do so. I will tell you, being a mother of young boys, this was hard for me to process these scenarios just because it was almost a little sad to not be allowed to express complex human emotion. So I'm going to walk you through. And again, I encourage everyone to create a dialogue in the chat, share experiences with each other. You're welcome to unmute and chat your experiences and your thoughts about these scenarios. So I'll start with childhood. We have a 5-year-old boy, just fell, scraped his knee. It's not serious, it does hurt. They're scared because it is bleeding. You're crying and you're looking to the adult to comfort. You want to know that you're going to be okay. When you're reaching for that hug, you're told to man up. The injury's not that bad, you're being such a baby. So moving on to, say you're 10 and you're throwing a ball around, whether it's that football, you're not really into football, but you like your older brother. And this is the only way that y'all can bond. So you're trying to make your older brother proud and you're trying to bond with them by throwing the ball, and you get dissed out, what I call dissed. You're throwing like a girl. So I want to share those scenarios with you and encourage you all to share any feedback that you get, or what are some of the emotions that are coming up for you.
Hello, can you hear me?
I can, yes.
Hi. So I want to say, like, I think my way of thinking was a lot different. Maybe like the way that I grew up, before even studying mental health, was maybe like having those judgments, like, okay, man up. But now that I have a son, he's 3 months, I think the idea has changed, maybe biasly, but I'm glad that it has like given me that different perspective that's closer to heart.
Yes, well, thank you for sharing and congratulations on your baby. That is amazing. They will keep you on your toes. My oldest is 23 and he's still on my toes. Thank you for sharing. I do appreciate that.
We also have some comments in the chat. Nia saying familiarity, sadness. We also have uncaring, sadness, and shame. Tim says, I was so lucky to have parents that were less blatant with the gender role socialization, but I was completely aware of the expectations from other men and boys in my life.
Right. Thank you. Thank y'all all for sharing. And it was true. This is, oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
I was just thinking, I remember before taking this job, having to really be mindful of the way I joke, kind of being self-deprecating, but I remember always making excuses, like when I'd start to tear up about something or have like a serious emotion, I would kind of play it off by saying, oh my gosh, I'm being such a big girl, and then realizing, what, that probably is not the best thing to say. But it's funny. I felt like I had to make an excuse for a normal
emotion. Yes. Thank you for sharing that. Thank you for being brave and sharing that, because it is true. I've heard that my whole childhood, quit being a girl, quit being a little girl. And I know recently we watched Maleficent 2, great movie. If you haven't seen it, by the way, I don't want to give any spoilers, but there was a highly emotional scene and my husband started getting the tears and he did everything he could to hold them back because it is unmanly to cry at a movie. And so it was almost just so prevalent that that thought process, that societal structure, even in my own home, where I was like, cry, that was really sad. It was a really sad scene. So, all right, I'll move on to the teen. Here's another scenario. Your body's changing. You're not sure who you are. Life is confusing. So you're 15 years old. Things are getting real. And you're used to talking to your childhood friend about these feelings. However, his older brother overhears the conversation and he mocks, oh, isn't that cute? You two dating now? What's next? Hugging? And he makes a derogatory remark calling them, poking fun at their potential sexual orientation, if any. And this one got me thinking, this scenario gets me thinking a lot because that always seems to be the first insult or ridicule that comes out when two men are showing emotion, especially with each other or two young boys trying to bond, is the implication that they are, the implication that they're gay. And how that in itself was built to be a dishonor and an insult. So I do want to walk y'all through, what are your thoughts or anything y'all would want to share with this scenario?
One thing that comes to mind for me, Erika, I think kind of some of the intersections with this, because, I grew up, my family's Persian. And so it's really normal for Persian men, of all ages, even adult men, to like kiss each other on the cheeks and hug. And hearing from, my, maybe American, more westernized, that white friends to say like, that's weird. Like, is your, is your dad gay or your uncle's gay? Like, why do they do that? And just seeing how that, impacted my brothers, because I have an older brother and younger brother, and how that, got internalized in so many ways, and just how heartbreaking that can be, and still
Right.
is.
Right. Thank you for sharing that. Thank you. That is very true. I know at this time when my brothers were in their teens, I was quite younger, but the bonding that they had to grow accustomed to was punching each other in the shoulder. Hey man, what's up? And that was almost the only allowed kind of connection, which I'm wondering how much was missed out on at that point. But thank you for sharing that.
We also have in the chat, I can relate. At the beginning of my relationship, my partner would hold his tears all the time, feeling embarrassed and covering his face. Years later, has learned, can cry in space with me.
Thank you for sharing that. So I'll move on to, I'm sorry.
So sorry, Erica, we have one raised hand, Selma.
Yes, of course.
I just wanted to add in regards to how the older sibling was responding. I think it has a lot to do with, or I feel like it has a lot to do with maybe that kid's upbringing. Maybe it makes them uncomfortable to see his younger sibling and his close friend having such a close relationship, maybe. So he feels like he's gotta be the more masculine one, maybe. I know that like, I guess a lot of us grew up in a dysfunctional family, but like my brother and I have two other sisters, and my brother, I'm the youngest of four. He's always been very comfortable with himself. He's not afraid to compliment a good looking man. He's very just confident with himself, and I'm the same way. And then also in regards to the last thing that we had up here about the boys not being able to cry and stuff or man up. My dad is very old school. He immigrated here from Mexico, and he would even tell us girls to man up. And so if there's a problem, we face it, we deal with it. So I think it also is about the individual. When we were younger, it may have taken a negative, it made a negative effect on us. But as we got older, we're thankful for that now, because we've all been in situations where we've had to man up and take care of business on our own and support our children. And, because I left an abusive marriage and after 16 years, and I had to man up and take care of business, but I just feel it just really depends on how somebody absorbs that kind of information, whether they're going to be offended by it or not. When the brother says that, to the younger sibling and his friend. But that's just, my opinion.
Well, thank you for sharing it. I do appreciate it. The dialogue, it's very rich with all the perspectives that are shared here today. So thank you. Okay. And so the last one just kind of follows through adulthood. The same child, he was 5, 10, teens, and now we're here. His girlfriend, she just broke up with you. You're not doing well at work. You're feeling down. Talking with your buddy, it's not an option. You're strong, and you got to save face. But the pain is real, and you think, what if I just take myself out? So this one, again, this scenario is, of course, very triggering, and I want to make room for that statement in itself. But I have seen how these are some real thoughts as to growing up with some of those messages as we're following this hypothetical young man here, and then coming into the adulthood, having learned talking or reaching out for help is not an option. you know, feeling pain is not an option. So what's next, right? And so I do want to open up some space and see if there's any discussion or any thought process to this particular scenario. Okay, I'll go ahead and move on. I know that one was very heavy. So we saw the scenarios, and that's going to take us into the depression and anxiety in men. And again, I do want to just open up that just the societal structure is what I'm going to be concentrating on versus so much the individual. So like bringing the societal structures and what that looks like on an individual level to the person. Not everyone will feel this way. And of course, everyone is very different. Families are so diverse and very different. So it may look different or sound different or foreign. But again, this isn't meant to diagnose anyone or talk about, any mental health diagnosis in depth. Just talking a little bit about those societal structures and then providing some of the experiences that I've gained with, again, in my professional and personal life.
We did have one comment just pop up in the chat, Erika, that says the fact that he would rather die than open up his feelings is somewhat mind-blowing.
Right. And that's, as we get into the presentation or we get to the male suicide, that's one point is like, it's one big violent, self-violent act before anyone ever knew anything was wrong. And that seems to be a common theme. So again, the gender role strain. So this is going to summarize, that uneasy feeling, that negative consequence of gender role demands on the individual, on the young man, on the young boy or young adult man. So they're experiencing strain, one, deviating from masculine gender roles. So they're not able to not be a man. And I've heard that a lot through my professional and personal experience, that term, I had to be a man. I had to man up. I couldn't cry. I didn't want to appear weak. And so you're wondering that the toll that it's taking on an individual when they're consistently trying to meet these social norms of masculinity. If they're failing at them by societal standards, we do know that we're coming into an era where more and more of our youth are challenging these roles, right? But it isn't easy for them. I'm seeing that with my own young ones, being there to challenge some of these ideas of masculinity and having that ridicule come back by peers, family, people on the internet, because we know that children today are on the internet. And so experiencing conflict between these concepts of masculinity, either they're devaluing others for not upholding these masculine ideas, or they're receiving that. They're receiving that devaluation, those violations, so that ridicule, that bullying, that feedback that is causing a strain on the individual. And so then we get to the gender role conflict. And the strain is this conflict basically where, how do I best describe this without just reading this from the screen? Men having expressed that there are certain ways that they have to behave, certain areas, whether it's with a girlfriend, a boyfriend, at work, in the medical office, there's a way that they need to behave. And they do experience conflict, like almost a cognitive dissonance with the these four domains here when it comes to success, power, and competition. Most men that I have worked with, and unfortunately men who have offended that I have worked with, this came up a lot. The idea of being in control. And while they wouldn't use those words, they did tend to say things like, I'm a man, I'm supposed to provide. I'm a man, I'm supposed to make sure that my kids listen. I need to bring in the income. I need to be the final one to pull rank. And of course, while these are a select few of the population, definitely not speaking for men in general, but just knowing that these were men who had offended intimate partner violence, this was a common theme that like predicted the violence. It was a precursor to the violence, these attitudes, these beliefs of, no, I don't want to show my emotions to my partner. I do not want to appear vulnerable. I need to maintain to be in control because I am a man and that's what men do. And again, they weren't using these language. It was just a series of stories or experiences that they were talking about. And you gathered the theme and you start to hear it, that they were coming to a point where they were defending their manhood. And that, again, was the precursor to the violence. But again, that's a select few individuals. Those were men who had offended. Of course, that's not going to represent all men whenever they're experiencing this. But you do see that with other men as well, you know, where they have talked to me. And my brother's also kind of talking about, well, I don't want to share with my significant other because then they'll have more on me that they can use against me later. And it was always that general fear of appearing weak and how can that get turned around on them later. And so you do have a big question mark about the toll, the mental toll this is taking on an individual, really kind of implementing their own roles and rules on how they need to behave in different social settings.
And we have a comment from Tim, says, I remember in high school, a constant voice in my head. How am I seen? How can I prove my masculinity today? Not because it felt right, but just to avoid scrutiny, ridicule, or bullying. Like I always have to make sure I'm at least more masculine than several of the other men in the rooms to be safe.
Yes. Thank you, Tim, for sharing. Because I hear that across the board with a lot of men that I had worked with. And then, of course, in my personal life, my male friends, my husband, my sons, and then, of course, my 4 brothers. And that always seemed to be a theme, like, I got to be manlier than the man in the room. I got to be the alpha. And going back to those 2 emotions, humor, anger, and that always seemed to be the theme. Okay. So then we'll get into that depression and anxiety and a little bit about how men have shown these symptoms. And I want to point out a word, covert. And I want to invite everyone in the chat just to do a poll. Why do you think young boys and men have to express these symptoms covertly? Why does it have to be secretive when they're expressing anxiety and depression? So I want to challenge you all to share in the chat amongst each other, and I'll talk a little bit about these bullet points here. And then check in after I'm done. I'll check in to see if we have feedback that can be shared. So with that, you know, men having these symptoms, it looks as if it's irritability. One that I found particularly interesting was the sensitivity to threats to their self-esteem and respect. So being hypersensitive to someone, maybe calling them out, or maybe even a perceived threat to their respect, you know, or their manliness. And I thought that was very interesting that would be a covert symptom of depression in men. Somatic complaints. But this one also I thought was very interesting because while men who are experiencing depression and anxiety will complain of like stomach aches, headaches, you know, chronic pain of some sort, they're highly unlikely to seek medical attention for those as well. So then you do see men kind of falling through the gaps on not addressing their physical health that could potentially lead to addressing their mental health needs as well. Using aggression and violence to protect their own masculinity. And I talked about that earlier with a select few population of men that I've worked with, but it tended to be a general theme with men outside the battering intervention rooms as well, where they talked about, you know, using that aggression to almost avoid someone asking them, hey, are you okay? Do you need help? Because if they used violence, and when I say violence, not necessarily physical violence at times, but verbal violence, you know, to almost put up the guard, like, don't mess with me, I done told you to back off. And so that would prevent people from checking in and asking, hey, are you okay? Do you need to talk? Because even that would then threaten their manliness. Like, what do you mean, do I need to talk? And I saw this a lot in my personal relationships with men, you know, through my brothers. You know, it was almost insulting to infer like that, hey, do you need to talk? That was almost insulting to them as a man. Like, what do you mean, do I need to talk? No, I don't need to talk. I don't need to talk. I don't need to do that. And so it wasn't very surprising to see that men were least likely to reveal past trauma and least likely to fully participate in therapy, if they even got there, you know, if they even got into a therapy room to address these issues, they were least likely to fully participate. Again, feeling that potential shame that they're feeling complex human emotion, and they're being told by societal standards that this is not appropriate manly behavior. And then, of course, you know, alcoholism, substance abuse, to avoid trauma and to avoid those emotional discomforts. And that is highly prevalent. Even here in the coastal bend, we do see that highly prevalent, where men, you know, struggle with that substance abuse issues, to mind altering substances, and continuously using them to just, I just always use the expression, bottle it up, put it down, put it way down, don't address it. And so then you take the combination of all these bullet points, and then you add in the alcohol, and you start to see that impulsive behavior come out, that desperate trying to protect their own feelings and trying to protect the others from seeing them a certain way. So I'll check in if there were any feedbacks or comments or questions from the chat box.
We had a lot of great comments from fear, embarrassment. They are not acceptable in society or in their homes, so men will mask those emotions in a manner that is acceptable because it would put them in a vulnerable state, and they have been socialized never to be vulnerable. We have to take those emotions and express them in a socially acceptable ways, and using the only skills or tools we've been given for expression. We also have boys don't cry, passed down generation to generation, patriarchy. I feel that it comes from them using social media as a way to express themselves. This also brings in people that are able to help fight with this stigma, fight this patriarchy that affects us all. Common theme that I've seen from men in my family is not taking care of physical health and avoiding medical care. And then we do have a question: why do you think young men and boys have to express these symptoms covertly? Or maybe he was repeating that question. And then avoid state of vulnerability viewed as being weak, taught and learn at a young age to wear a mask.
Thank y'all all for sharing that wonderful feedback, because that is one of the goals of this presentation, is to get everyone talking. Start talking about this topic and what that looks like in our own lives, and then of course in our relationships, and then of course in our communities. So another chat box question I want to throw out there, and I encourage everyone to share the dialogue, and I'll check back in after I discuss a few of these bullet points. But do you think there's a gender bias in diagnosing depression and anxiety in men and boys? And so I'll let y'all share the feedback, and I'll check in after I talk a little bit about these bullet points here. So we do know that, and we're hearing it, we're hearing the themes of, manhood and just some of the ways that they're taught to behave, some of the societal structures there. And so it does become incredibly difficult for young boys and men to identify or even speak up about feelings of being sad, fearful, that they're in pain, either emotional or physical, because these things are seen, to be very feminine. They're going to appear that they're weak, and so that they just hold them in and that they don't address them. We also have to recognize that most young men and boys have experienced some type of trauma. The statistics are clear. There's physical abuse, sexual abuse, domestic violence, and the way young boys and men internalize this pain just adds to that emotional capacity that they have, that they're just piling it in, bottling it in. They cannot express this out in the open for the fear of appearing weak. And so we do know, with the diagnosis, gender bias. One, when you use the DSM to talk about depression, that's where the stat that men are 50% less often diagnosed with depression than women. And yet suicide rates, I apologize, I got feedback, so I didn't know if someone had unmuted. Okay, so yet suicide rates in men are 4 times higher than women. So I thought that was very telling, because I'm thinking, again, going back to the symptoms being very covert and not expressive. And then the other diagnosis bias that I had seen was the idea of antisocial personality disorder, which is usually diagnosed through, high levels of aggression or lack of remorse, or, not having empathy. And it almost sounds a little bit like how the societal structure tells men to behave. So I thought that was a bit of a bias there. And that most young boys and men are coming into the system, if you will, institutions, through punitive measures. So they got in trouble at school, they're fighting, they're bullying, they're aggressive, family violence at home. So you're seeing them come in for these types of interventions through punitive measures. So there is a bit of a bias there on what that looks like. And so we're, just kind of circling back to the poll, or even throwing another question out there, like, why do you think depression rates are reported to be higher in women than men? And I want to check in questions, comments, or anything that y'all would think to share.
We've had a couple comments. Someone just saying yes. Zelma saying, I feel it is a combination of gender bias and the fact most men do not talk about it. When they finally do, they still may not be diagnosed with depression due to the bias. Do I make sense here? Because men do not disclose, which, I think related to the gender bias and the socialization piece. I also, again, kind of going back to the GLBTQ, I think this is an area we see a lot of bias and maybe homophobia, discrimination, and just the higher rates too, sometimes of depression, and just how that mixes into the socialization of men and what, people feel comfortable sharing, or even how people identify what depression may look like and how that looks different for any different individual based on their experiences. We also have, sorry.
Go ahead.
I would bet that many men avoid ever getting in front of someone, who could provide depression diagnosis, while they may end up in front of someone who can provide an antisocial personality disorder after an act of aggression, assuming, but it would make sense. I have had male friends make outcries of depression and suicide and refusing counseling resources. I feel it is higher in women due to men don't talk about it or admit they are depressed. I'll pause and let you kind of respond. I know there's a couple, some things to unpack there.
Right. Thank you all for sharing and getting the conversation started. And so, yes, it does bring us into, male suicide. And we know that suicide rates are higher for men in general. And then also including the fact if they've been abused or had witnessed abuse in childhood, which is a common theme. And again, with men not wanting to seek help or therapy for this type of trauma and just kind of bottling it in, or even, how do you say it, out? Wow, I lost my train of thought and I apologize, everyone. Just the way they express that trauma, being through aggression, being through fighting, being through what would be seen as a conduct disorder, right? If you're just kind of looking at the DSM. And again, I don't have credentials to make these diagnoses, but just saying that their expression of that pain and trauma being through these channels is more likely that they're going to see more punitive interventions than that counseling and therapeutic intervention that is very needed. So we know that men constituted more than 70% of suicide deaths in the United States, 4 times more likely than women to commit suicide. And when I'm looking at these statistics, honestly, what I'm unpacking here is these are fathers, brothers, children. And this is really high statistics for someone to be taking their own life. And then just looking at the societal structures that are really bottlenecking the way that men can express their complex human emotions. And so that's what I unpack here for personally, and just looking at that. And I want to play a video. Now, this video, I got to give you all another trigger warning. These are quotes from real men who had survived their suicide attempt. And there's a theme throughout just kind of signaling that it was the last manly thing that they needed to do. I see a hand. Mr. Brian?
I was just going to ask if the rate was higher, is it talking about people who attempted suicide, or is it those that were successful at completing suicide? Because I thought the stat had something to do also with that men typically use more lethal ways in attempting suicide, and that skewed some of the higher numbers as far as following through. Does that make sense?
Right. Yes. And you know what? I know that the top stats are completed, like completions, but that last one, the Texas ones, were the attempts in youth. And so when we talk about that skew, and don't get me wrong, because that's an interesting point to bring up, that could increase the numbers of suicide completion because they're using more lethal means like firearm, hanging, right? And it kind of goes back to that gender role too, that women are suicide attempting to gain attention, so they're more likely to do the pills or the razors to the wrist, where there's a chance of survival, versus men being, again, even their suicide attempt had to be manly. What would society say about a man who took a bunch of pills and was looking for that cry for help? So that kind of plays into what the survivors were saying when they actually had survived their attempts, was that the suicide itself, or the attempt for the survivors itself, had to appear manly, which we're seeing as more lethal means to commit suicide, like using the firearm, almost making it clear, like, I don't want to survive this. And then there was that strong link between alcohol and suicide completion. So there was a big correlation there. And then again, we go back to how men were using alcohol and substances to numb that pain, and then having the correlation between being, intoxicated and then, completing their suicide. So those were some highlights to take away. And so I'm going to play this video again, some trigger warning. There's some quotes from men who had survived their suicide attempt. And just to get the themes, and I'll let the video complete. I'll give y'all a moment to process, because it is, very emotional, it's deep. And then I'll move on to the next section. All right. So again, I just want to give everyone a minute. I know that seeing quotes in that manner can be very triggering. So just give everyone like a small second to come back before we get into our next section of how we can help. And again, the conversation isn't meant to provide a solution, but to get that conversation started, because the solution is always going to look different for everyone and in everyone's communities. So before I play another little video, now this is a trailer because I can't play the full documentary for y'all, but if you've been in this movement for quite some time, you're probably familiar with a documentary called Mask You Live In. And before I play the trailer, I do want to tell you a little story about the notion of how can we help and how do we change this. And it started with a conversation in the Coastal Bend here in Corpus Christi when we were looking at moving prevention efforts with the men in our community. Now, we had always done this documentary in our battering intervention groups. With the offenders that had come in, they had offended intimate partner violence. And we would show them the documentary and do an exercise with them and talk a little bit about some of the emotions that they put behind their masks. What was it that they were hiding from family, friends, loved ones, their partner? And it was interesting, some of their answers and their very raw emotion in it. And it wasn't uncommon for men in the group to cry and to talk about their past trauma and talk about the first time that they had seen violence, and really get into that that area where they're talking about all the things that they were putting behind their mask. Then we showed the trailer to male leaders in our community when we're having this conversations, roundtable forum, inviting men to, to the table and talking to us about their experiences. And one thing, my aha moment was, wow, the experiences were the same. They were the same for men who had offended and men who had not, men who were pillars in our community and really actively involved in trying to push prevention here in the Coastal Bend. Just the way they internalized and expressed it, of course, was very, very different. But when the men were just getting into their real discussion and really relating to some of the things that they were hearing in just the trailer, because we didn't do the full documentary in our community forum, but they were able to really talk about having received these messages and talk about some of the ways that they first heard these things or experienced violence or saw violence, and how they could bring that to the table. And the general consensus was, how can we help? It was basically, we need to reach young men and boys, and we need to normalize complex human emotion and take the gender out of it. And that came from our male leaders. That was the one thing that they all agreed upon, that this is where we needed to go with our prevention efforts. And so that, of course, spawned more prevention programming in the Coastal Bend. But I want to show y'all the trailer because I think it's very, very important to start that conversation of how we can help in case y'all hadn't seen it. And then feel free to put in the chat, what are you thinking? What are you feeling as this video plays? I will warn you, there's bad language, offensive language, forceful language. So please take warning to that. And we will regroup after the video plays and talk a little bit about how we can help and what that looks like to each our own communities.
Erika?
Yes.
If I could real quick, I just wanted to notice, like in some of the previous slides, there were stats about like high rates of suicide amongst certain some BIPOC men, particularly I believe it was Indigenous men, and maybe I can't remember the other group because it flashed really quick. But also there was stats like a couple before that about like the #1 reason for death for young Black men was homicide. And I think it's just kind of important. It's a whole long conversation to have, but I think it's just important to kind of notice that the impact of racism and white supremacy on violence and toxic masculinity, how our society casts BIPOC men, particularly young Black men, as more dangerous and also as impervious, more impervious to pain. So like that justifies increased violence towards them, and that racism also impacts the availability of all kinds of services, including mental health services. So I think, there are some common experiences, but it's also important to recognize the very different experiences that can happen because of racism and white supremacy in our culture.
Right. Thank you, Tim, for pointing that out, because you're right, it's very, very important. And young Black men and young Latinx men are more likely to see that punitive measure of intervention than young white men. And that is a fact. So, thank you, Tim, for pointing that out. I appreciate it. Okay.
Stop crying.
Stop with the tears.
Don't cry. Pick yourself up.
Stop with the emotion.
Don't be a pussy. Don't let nobody disrespect you.
Be cool and be kind of a dick.
Always keep your mouth shut.
Nobody likes a tattletale.
Bros come before hoes.
Don't let your woman run your life.
You a bitch. What a fag.
Get laid. Do something.
Be a man.
Be a man.
Grow some balls.
The 3 most destructive words that every man receives when he's a boy is when he's told to be a man.
We've constructed an idea of masculinity in the United States that doesn't give young boys a way to feel secure in their masculinity, so we make them go prove it all the time.
Within their peer group culture, each of them is posturing based on how the other boys are posturing, and what they end up missing is what they each really want, which is just that closeness.
In good times, guys are like really close to each other, but when things get a little bit worse, you're on your own.
From middle school, I had 4 really close friends. Once I kind of went into high school, I struggle finding people I can talk to because I feel like I'm not supposed to get help.
Our kids get up every morning. They have to prepare their mask for how they're going to walk to school. A lot of our students don't know how to take the mask off. What is it you don't let people see? Almost 90% of you have pain and anger on the back of that paper.
If you never cry, then you have all these feelings stuffed up inside of you, and then you can't get them out.
They really buy into a culture that doesn't value what we've feminized. If we're in a culture that doesn't value caring, doesn't value relationships, doesn't value empathy, you are going to have boys and girls, men and women go crazy.
I had anger issues in high school. I felt like an outcast.
I've been suspended at least once every year I was here.
We would just look for trouble and just like try to fight.
Boys are more likely to act out. They're more likely to become aggressive. Most people miss that as depression, or see it as a conduct disorder, or just a bad kid.
I felt like just giving up on life. You know, I actually had suicide thoughts in my head at 6th grade.
I felt alone for a long time, and I actually thought about killing myself.
Whether it's homicidal violence or suicidal violence, people resort to such desperate behavior only when they are feeling shamed and humiliated, or feel they would be if they didn't prove that they were real men.
If you're told from day one, don't let nobody disrespect you, and this is the way you handle it as a man, respect is linked to violence.
If I can man up, why step down from that, you feel me?
It's like instinct.
So man up! Man up! Man up! Man up! Hold your fucking balls! Act like a man! Be a man.
Be a man!
For my kids, I was gonna end this hyper-masculine narrative here.
So I will tell you, if y'all have not seen that documentary, I highly recommend it. It is very eye-opening for a lot of people, and it does justice in getting that conversation started with your own communities, with your own leaders, and those who want to join in this prevention movement. And when you think about prevention, you cannot ignore the societal level expectations that are unrealistic, and how are they harming our young boys and men. So I want to check in before we get into the next section of how we can, or just kind of continuing that, how we can help. And what are y'all thinking? What are y'all feeling? Where do you see that we can change the conversation within your own communities?
We have a couple of comments so far. One asking where to find the documentary, and then regarding your question just now, schools, and another person saying that I feel so sad. I'm in a community educator, and this is part of what we do.
And thank you for doing that work. Community education, that's hard work. I can tell you that. It's hard work. So thank y'all. Keep doing that. So we had come up with this a parent's guide. Now this can be very beneficial for any adult role model or professional who works with youth. We wanted to really be able to communicate this. We turned it into a flyer so we can pass it out a little easier, but to communicate these different lenses to some of our male leaders who are working with youth, some of the parents in our community, as a way to really promote this foundation of changing what it means to be a man, or a young boy, a young man. And so we came up with this little guide here, and I do believe it's going to be in our resource list, as well as where to find the documentary. We personally purchased it off Amazon Prime. I don't know that it was too expensive. It was like $9.99 maybe to rent. I would have to get the cost for you, but I highly recommend it. So you could find it on Amazon Prime, and I can also share the link in the comment section. Let me see if I can find that for you.
I think I found it and shared it.
Oh, perfect. Thank you.
Sorry, it took me a second.
Oh, no, thank you. I appreciate it. And so just looking at this, and again, this is going to be in the resource list, so feel free to use it in your communities. You know, you could change the colors, rebrand it, however you need to, but we wanted to go through that male stereotypes and talk about, you know, the fuller range of emotions and behaviors and how our adults can role model that, especially men who were working with youth and how they could role model that. So I know that we're coming up close to noon. I can feel it that the hour is ending upon us. But I will share just a couple of self-care practices that we need to normalize for the men in our life. Now, I do this for, of course, my sons. They're a big fan of journaling. And not only do they journal, they do photography. They took my hobby and they made it better. I don't know how they did it, but they are amazing. As well as my non-gendered spirit took up photography, and they're just amazing. So I want to encourage everyone to share, if you want to share how you practice self-care and what that looks like for the men in our lives, and how do we start to normalize that complex human emotion for everyone. And I will share a video in the chat box. It's called the Progressive Muscle Relaxation. So it's kind of like a how-to. And I was told that people are a big fan because apparently you flex your muscles and then you unflex, and you do that from like head to toe, and it's supposed to relax you and rejuvenate you. So let me see if I can share this.
As you're doing that, I'll read some of the other comments. So thank you. I love progressive muscle relaxation. We also have reading and journaling, mustache wax and conditioner. That's a great way. Art, music, listening, playing it, yoga, meditation, talking with friends, nature, video games.
Oh, I love that. Yes. We have to take time for ourselves. I personally got my husband involved in sitting on our patio every morning or every Saturday morning to look at the birds, to watch birds. And he always says, I'm so glad you don't make fun of me, because I feel like my buddies at work would make fun of me that I'm sitting outside looking at birds. And I'm like, really? Even that? So it just lends itself to everything we talked about. But thank you all for sharing a little bit of the self-care, since I know that the hour is upon us, and I do want to take some time in case there are questions, and remind you all to follow us on Facebook and Instagram. We do a lot. Our digital educator, Nora, is amazing. She's always sharing prevention activities, articles, facts, and motivational Mondays. So if you need that boost at the start of your work week, I highly encourage you to follow us so you can get that those nice quotes and motivation. But if there's any questions that we can take the last 10 minutes or not, it's up to y'all.
While y'all think, I'll read some of the other activities people mentioned: the gym, the beach, and Netflix. Someone else mentioned going out in my backyard every morning, drink my coffee, and watch the sunrise. It is so peaceful. I'm bummed when it's cloudy. Oh, that does sound wonderful.
Yes. Oh, yes. Mm-hmm.
Oh, I see a hand raised.
Okay.
Yeah,
Yes.
go ahead and unmute yourself.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes. Hello. Hi.
Hi. Have you ever had a situation in which maybe you were handing out those pamphlets at a school and a parent asked or stated their concerns that they don't want their son emasculated? And if so, how did you handle that situation, or what are your thoughts on how best to handle that type of situation?
That's a great question. I have not personally had that through the flyer. Other areas of my work, I do come across that a lot. And it is quite challenging because you're like, oh, we still have a long way to go, in this work, in this movement. But typically I just, hey, parenting's, I try to keep it light, breezy, brief. But hey, parenting is a hard job. These are tools, and I hope that you can take something from it. I definitely don't try to argue with them. Typically, if someone is going to say something like that in a setting, it's brief. They just want to win right there in the moment. And I'm very familiar with working with people who need to be, in control of the conversation. And so it's basically like okay, disengage, like, hey, this is a tool. Parenting is a job for a village. And I'm hoping that you can take something from this information. And honestly, if they take the flyer and they're still just like, they have it and they're still just talking mess, I guess, there's my coastal bin coming out. I'm like, hey, well, at least they took the flyer. But if not, it's typically like, hey, they wanted to say what they wanted to say and they're gone. And I mean, a part of me is very sad, but another part of me is knowing, well, maybe that parent didn't want this information, but other parents do. And we're seeing that our community be a little bit more receptive to that, especially if you could have male community leaders who do that for you, I guess, or, like, hey, we're on board with this, and maybe that would help, get buy-in from the parents. Like if it's the ROTC chief who's handing this out and talking about it and say, hey, I received this from our agency who's trying to improve the lives of young men and boys, and we think it's important. Like maybe as a strategic planning, if that makes sense. But that's kind of my my experience with, or what I would do in that situation. But other experiences is usually people either coming to a tabling event to say things that are inappropriate, or parents just typically being very cautious that we're going to promote promiscuous children, that we're going to promote sexual activity. I know that's always been a big barrier for us in doing our work here in the Coastal Bend. And then, of course, in my professional experience working with men who have offended, they do have a lot of those very deep-seated attitudes and beliefs about not wanting their children to be emasculated.
We also have a question, Erika, that says, is there anything the younger generations can do to help out in their community or bring awareness about these issues? If so, what and how?
Yeah, I think our younger generations that are coming out have been so fierce, so vocal, just not afraid to take a stand. And I think that's great. I think just starting the conversation in general, one voice at a time. And one thing I tell my young kiddos, and I know my staff, my educators who go out in the community and work with youth, consistently remind them that they are the future. They are our allies. They are our advocates. They're creating a wave. Do not stop. We try to remove adultism out of the equation whenever we're working with youth, but encouraging them. And the other advantage, and I know this is kind of silly, but the other advantage is youth today are more advanced in their levels of communication when it comes to social media, chatting. I know there's so many new apps today that I'm not even familiar with. but they're intelligent in that. And that's how they create trends, and that's how they create movements. And I think with some of the themes of the younger generation being so outspoken and so fierce and being like, no, this isn't right, we're going to change it, is gold to keep that momentum and to keep it going, and hopefully find some allies who are willing to stand with you in case you're in a community who's not so open to those types of messages, or even just promoting it online or through your chat groups, trying to change a culture within your gaming groups. I know my kiddos are always, they got their headsets on and they're playing with someone in Germany, and trying to change that culture, even the way male gamers approach female gamers, or even gamers who don't choose a gender, right? And just trying to almost advocate and be an ally in those gaming circles as well. I think there's lots of opportunity, and I give the youth, our generation coming in, just so much respect for being so fierce, outspoken, and just being our future leaders.
Thank you so much, Erika. And we have a lot of comments just thanking you in the chat, saying they love this topic. So thank you, thank you. Please don't forget to fill out the survey. If you have also additional questions that you want us to pass along to Erika, or you can reach out to Erika on the Purple Door on Facebook or Instagram, or you can reach out to us at conference@tasa.org. Other than that, I do want to also thank our amazing interpreters for their amazing work during this session. Thank you, thank you, thank you. And if no one has anything else, please enjoy your lunch. There is an afternoon session for IAFN if you want to figure out what they're doing. And from there, I'm just going to take us out with a song to kind of bring us into the lunchtime mode.
Bye, everyone. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye.